was this axiomatic thinking. It was just in Truman's mind, this was outrageous and he was going to respond. But that was the start of it. And of course, the bitter war for 3 years ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. And technically, the United States and North Korea are still at war. Now, with 7 decades of enmity, we've wound up with a Korean peninsula in which there's a demilitarized zone in the center, but the demilitarized zone is surrounded by heavily armed forces. At one point, the North Koreans had 100,000 troops within 100 kilometers of the DMZ, and the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division stationed just south of the DMZ, and that's American troops in Korea comes to about 28,000. And in visiting the DMZ in the 1980s, I was struck at how undemilitarized it was. And if we looked at the tunnels that the North Koreans had dug under the DMZ, they were clearly planning an invasion of the South. So there was a demilitarized zone which solidified the armistice. And what you do if you're North Koreans, you dig under it. And similarly, when the United States in the 70s was trying to clear some trees in the DMZ so that we could see, our guards could see the actions on the border more clearly, North Koreans killed a number of American troops that were basically clearing these trees. And there's a long history of actions which are really quite risky. For example, the most recent, I suppose, would be the North Korean actions in 2010, where they sank a South Korean naval ship, the Cheonan, and shelled islands and killed South Korean citizens. And that's an extraordinarily risky action to take. But the North Koreans were prepared to take that kind of risk. So you go back to what I said about where are we in terms of managing a process. There are lots of wild cards here. And we really, even though the North Koreans are not suicidal, they are often risk acceptant. They're willing to take risks that could lead to the miscalculations that I've referred to historically. The current phase of the hostility between the United States and North Korea goes back to 1992 and 3, when the North Koreans violated their safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency and began reprocessing plutonium from the Yongbyon reactor. And first they denied it. Indeed, after having separated the plutonium, they tried to cover this up by burying the tanks and planting a forest of trees on top of it. The only trouble is, Ezra will remember, when we looked at the photographs, we noticed that all these pine trees and fir trees had died in the pattern of the tank underneath it. There was so much radioactivity coming up that even though you planted this forest, you could see the outlines of where the tanks were. So not a very successful cover, to say the least. But anyway, that led to the North Koreans essentially withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It led to intense diplomacy between the United States and North Korea, which created the so-called Agreed Framework. But it didn't stop North Korea's efforts to get the nuclear weapon. It just diverted it somewhat. The result of this is that after nearly 30 years of this latest phase of the hostility, which I would call the nuclear phase, is that there's deep mistrust on both sides. North Korea thinks the United States wants to destroy its regime, and it believes that possession of nuclear weapons is the only way to guarantee its security. And the United States pressures on denuclearization are, in the North Korean eyes, deceptive. They're ways to take away the one strong card that North Korea has in its hand. So when you say, well, why would you cheat and deceive the Americans on one agreement after another, it's because the whole American approach is basically to deceive us, to think that we'll be treated normally if we don't have nuclear weapons. And the United States cites the many efforts to negotiate where North Korea has violated agreements, such as the original withdrawal from the NPT in '93, or developing enrichment despite the '94 agreed framework, violating the leap year moratorium in '07 and so forth. So mistrust on the American side is that, well, we've tried to negotiate with you and you've constantly violated each agreement we've made. Indeed, with the leap year moratorium, it was violated within days or weeks of the agreement. So deep mistrust on both sides about intentions in this nuclear phase of the hostility. Now, despite United Nations sanctions and alleged condemnation of other countries represented in those sanctions, the North Koreans are continuing their nuclear missile tests. The 6th nuclear test last week, they claimed, was a thermonuclear device. It's a little bit unclear whether it really was what we would call thermonuclear and hydrogen bomb, or whether it's what we would call boosted fission, where you wrap thermonuclear materials around a normal atomic bomb. But the point is, it was about 5 times stronger than their previous devices. And they've announced their goal of miniaturizing the warhead and making it capable of hitting the United States. So their missile tests are getting more and more capable in terms of longer distances, and their miniaturization of a powerful warhead is making progress. And it's possible that in a matter of a few years, they might be able to credibly say that they can strike a significant portion of the U.S. mainland. That's often exaggerated in the press, in which people fail to see that the re-entry vehicle and targeting the re-entry vehicle is an extremely difficult part of this trajectory and arc, and we've seen very little about that. So the fact that you make a missile go up and go a certain number of kilometers or miles is only half the story. But so there's an exaggeration of how imminent the North Korean hitting the mainland of the U.S. is. But it's a clearly stated goal, and they are making progress. And it's plausible that somebody like Sid Hecker, former director of Los Alamos, says that in a few years they'll have that capability. Now, President Trump has said he will not allow that. That's intolerable and unacceptable. So, if true that the North Koreans continue to make progress, and that the President of the United States has said he will not allow it, we are headed for something which could be a crisis or a confrontation, which would raise the kinds of questions that I mentioned from the historical examples cited earlier. So let's turn away from those risks and the escalation and ask, what are the prospects for reconciliation? In other words, suppose we say, is it plausible that we could avoid this impending crisis through a process of reconciliation? And there, when we look to international relations theory, you see that there are over the years, there's been a considerable development in theorizing about this. In the 1950s, Carl Deutsch, our former colleague here at Harvard, developed the idea of what he called a security community. And a security community is a set of countries where there's reliable expectations of no war. And Deutsch argued this evolves out of transactions and interchange and so forth. And he cited Scandinavia. You see, we always think of the Scandinavians as peaceful, but there was a period when the Scandinavians were just the opposite of peaceful. But that over time, you developed a security community in Scandinavia. And of course, the same was true with Western Europe. And this was reinforced by another book of the 1950s by Ernst Haas, Berkeley, called The Uniting of Europe, in which he said that if you add to the change in attitudes that grow out of transactions, institutions, then you can get a situation where war becomes unthinkable. So Germany and France, which have gone to war 3 times in 70 years and torn Europe apart in the process, if we look at Europe today, Europe may have a few problems, but the prospect of a war between Germany and France is not one of them. It's just really, literally unthinkable. And think of what that means in terms of the nature of international relations. And it's a good example that reconciliation can work. And it makes a huge difference when it does. In the 1980s, there was a revival of Immanuel Kant's democratic peace theory by Michael Doyle, Princeton, Bruce Ruskin, Yale, and others. And their argument is that historically, there are very few examples of democracies, particularly liberal democracies, going to war with each other. And that if you have democratization and democracy spreads, this can create security communities and make war unthinkable. And for evidence, they might cite the democratization of South Africa or the democratization of Brazil and Argentina in the 80s, which has made war in those cases highly unlikely. On the other hand, the same theory, Kant's democratic peace theory, was popular both with President Clinton and President George W. Bush. And George W. Bush thought that by democratizing Iraq, you could create conditions for peace in the Middle East. That proved to be a severe miscalculation. And part of the reason is that when people talked about democratization and democratic peace theory, they were really talking about liberal democracy, not plebiscitarian or majoritarian democracy. And whatever else was created in Iraq, it wasn't a liberal democracy. And wherever we might think we could get with North Korea in a decade or so, I don't expect it to look like liberal democracy. In 2010, Charles Kupchan at the Council on Foreign Relations wrote a book called How Enemies Become Friends. And he said, if you want to create stable peace, there have to be 3 conditions. One, he called institutional restraints. Second, compatible social orders. And 3, cultural community. Well, if those are the conditions for stable peace between the United States and North Korea, God help us, because I don't see any of those being accomplished in the next decade or so. Other people have said, well, what about the theories that I developed in the 1990s about soft power and smart power? And it obviously is important to use soft power, but the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, which is what soft power consists of, requires that you look attractive in the eyes of the beholder. And so the question is, how much attraction is there in North Korea toward the United States? Well, not much. Kim Jong-il used to like to look at Hollywood movies, but that had no effect on his behavior. And similarly, while it's great to have visits of the New York Philharmonic and others, that didn't have any lasting effect. So in the sense of, is the United States attractive, and would cultural exchanges make the United States attractive in North Korea? I don't think the chances of developing soft power there in the near term are very good either. For one thing, what difference does it make whether a certain portion of the North Korean population sees the U.S. as attractive? It really, in a dictatorship, is irrelevant to the questions of how their government will behave. So unfortunately, I fear that, and I've said this a number of times, that my work on soft power, well, I stand by it for many different areas. I don't think it has a lot to contribute to the situation that we're in between the United States and North Korea. So, if the prospects of reconciliation in the sense of becoming friends is very slight in terms of the near term of decades, what about that second meaning of reconciliation as the reduction of enmity? In other words, if we go from this high threshold of stable expectations of peace and friendship, say that's not likely in the next decade or two, but could we look for that second or lower threshold that I mentioned at the beginning, which is the reduction of enmity? Is that a more promising route to take? And here, there may be more hope. If you go back to this book of Kupchins that I mentioned, How Enemies Become Friends, he argues that stable peace breaks out through stages. The first stage is unilateral accommodation. The second is reciprocal restraint. The third is societal integration. And the fourth is new narratives and identities. Now, we're a long way from societal integration or new narratives and identities, but it's possible that you could imagine unilateral accommodation and reciprocal restraint occurring. And the question then we have to ask is there a prospect for that first stage of accommodation and reciprocity in the U.S.-North Korean relationship? Well, what do we learn from history on this? There are historical examples of enemies becoming friends, and without huge periods, of many, many decades. For example, in 1895, the United States and Britain almost came to war over a boundary dispute in South America, the boundary between Venezuela and British Guyana. And yet, within 2 decades, they were allies together in World War I. And the interesting point there is Britain accommodated the U.S. because of the rise of Germany and Russia. It basically was saying we can no longer carry out the foreign policy we had of stability in Europe and stability in the Far East, given the rise of Germany and Russia, and also try to police the Western Hemisphere, where the Americans live. And so the British made a decision to swallow their pride and to basically accommodate the United States. And the United States could be quite outrageous at times. When Teddy Roosevelt, the Venezuelan border dispute was with Grover Cleveland as president, a Democrat. But Teddy Roosevelt became president, there was still a dispute about the boundary between Alaska and Canada. And Roosevelt basically set up a stacked arbitration commission to make sure that we got what we wanted. And the British swallowed hard and went along with it, because it was more important to accommodate the Americans because of these larger questions. Another historical example is the United States and China. The United States and China had fought in Korea in 1950 after China crossed the Yalu when we went up close to the Chinese border. And we went through a period in the 1950s in which we demonized what we called Red China. They were irrational, they were totalitarian, they were a danger to the world, and so forth. Indeed, in 1964, as China was developing its first nuclear test, the United States, under Lyndon Johnson, contemplated a preemptive strike to prevent China developing nuclear weapons. Interesting to ask what U.S.-China relations would look like today if we were going forward with that, but that's a side thought. In any case, the Americans basically switched quite dramatically with 1971 and Richard Nixon's visit to China. And the United States accommodated China. It's not as though China changed internally. It accommodated China because it saw this relationship with China as a way to counter growing Soviet military strength. And that opened the door for what has subsequently become a massive economic interdependence between the two countries, even if that interdependence is sometimes accompanied by skeptical narratives. Nonetheless, I think you can make a case that it introduced the prospect of a war between the United States and China. So that's a second example of accommodation in the sense that I used reconciliation, meaning reduction of enmity. A third and a somewhat more problematic example is the United States and the Soviet Union. In the bipolar structure of power and the intense antagonism of the early Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union really had very little positive relationship. And we came very close to a nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. One of the effects, though, of that scare of 1962 was John F. Kennedy realized that this path we were on was a potential path to disaster. And he gave a speech at American University on June 10, 1963, which to me has always been the great speech of his administration. Everybody cites his inaugural address, "Ask not what you can do," and so forth. The really interesting speech was the American University speech in June 63, in which he says, "We cannot continue on the path of extreme hostility with the Soviets that we're on now." The net effect of that was by the end of the year we signed the limited threshold treaty for banning nuclear explosives in the atmosphere. In 1968 we signed a non-proliferation treaty, and in the 70s and 80s we had bilateral treaties, SALT and START, with the Soviet Union. It's not that we liked the Soviet Union or trusted them or had much contact with them. There were very few Soviet students coming to American universities. Very little trade between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is very different from China today, for example. But we were intensely aware of the security interdependence, and that led us to a set of agreements which I think didn't solve the nuclear problem, but did at least reduce the temperature. It reduced the degree of enmity. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, you really began rapprochement and true reconciliation under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Unfortunately, and it's a long story that I won't go into today, that was reversed under Putin, and we now have today a situation of considerable hostility. So that was a partial reconciliation in my second sense of reducing enmity, but an imperfect one. So what's the prospect of negotiating with North Korea, of having something where we begin to have at least the Soviet level reduction of enmity, if not the US-British situation before World War I? Well, to assess that properly, we have to be realistic about negotiations. There's always a danger that if you say the first step in this process of reconciliation is accommodation, as Kapshin says, that you can have deceptive accommodation because there's no real reciprocity. And the classic example of this was Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler at Munich. Now, appeasement is not a bad thing per se. It's a well-accepted technique of international diplomacy. In fact, what the British did with the United States in the 1890s was appeasement, and it worked. So we have taken the concept of appeasement and sort of made it anathema, which is a great mistake, because we apply it just to the case of Munich. And you will find various proposals for trying to get out of our conflict with North Korea today are often people who propose them are called appeasers. We should pay no attention to that. There's nothing wrong with appeasement per se. What's wrong is if you appease when you haven't thought through your opponent's objectives. Whether appeasement works or doesn't work depends on your assessment of the opponent's objectives. Henry Kissinger, in trying to assess this in his famous book, The World Restored, in the 1950s, was to distinguish between what he called status quo and revisionist states. Status quo states may be rivals, they may be competitors, they may be difficult, but they basically accept the broad parameters of the status quo. Revisionist states are states which want to totally transform the status quo. And if you use the analogy of a poker game, somebody comes into a poker game and says, I want to have more winnings at this table. You know, I want my pot of chips to grow. That's normal behavior. But if somebody comes in and says, this game is stacked, I don't like you people, and I'm going to kick over the table and all the chips are spread all over the floor, that's a revisionist situation. And Kissinger argued that Napoleon was a revisionist. He was not interested in reaching accommodation among the states in Europe in the early 19th century. But after Napoleon was defeated, and you had the Congress of Vienna, they were able to create for some 30 or 40 years what was called the Concert of Europe, in which royalist France was reintegrated into the European balance of power, and there were rough rules of the road of how you managed your enmity. Dick Rosecrans has written very well about this some time ago. Now, the interesting question is, how do we assess the goals of the opponent? Napoleon was clear. He was a revisionist. And when you look at the goals of Hitler or Stalin, I think they were revisionists. And I don't think China today is revisionist in that sense. I think it wants more earnings or winnings at the table, but doesn't want to kick over the table because it's done pretty well at the table. And the question is then, what are the goals of North Korea? Is North Korea, under the Kim regime, a status quo or revisionist country. If it's a revisionist country and we misassessed it the way that Chamberlain misassessed Hitler's objectives at Munich, we're simply laying up greater problems for ourselves in the future. I think most historians looking back would say that the failure of the Western democracies to stand up to Hitler while Hitler was weaker in the 1930s was a great mistake. It had unleashed a decade of genocide and world war. On the other hand, the way we're dealing with China today, which I don't think poses an existential threat to us, is a way in which we can compete, can have strong differences, but in which we see China as having basically not full status quo, but largely accepting the framework of the current order, and that's led to an effective accommodation that I described a bit earlier. Now, if the North Koreans are purely a status quo country, or primarily a status quo country, then if what they really want is security, if they say, I just need these nuclear weapons so you can't overthrow my regime, then you know what? This problem has a pretty easy solution in accommodation, which is to say, leave them alone. Basically sign a peace treaty, relax sanctions, let them grow, and as they grow economically, the nature of their society will change, which is the Chinese argument about how to handle North Korea. And we've got a problem which is relatively easily resolved if we can make the first step of accommodation. However, if they really are revisionist, then that may not be the right answer. And the question there is, given the nature of the regime and the extent to which it is a dynasty, a family dynasty, which has always struck me as an interesting anomaly of 3 generations of a monarchy and a communist country, but leave that aside. But if the dynasty rests upon the ideology of being the heart of the Korean people, and that they represent the future and progress of the Korean people, and they will unify the Korean people in the peninsula, and that mission allows the regime to preserve the ideology and legitimacy that it needs to stay in power domestically, then it's going to be a lot harder to deal with. I thought one of the nicest expressions of this problem was by our Tufts colleague, Sun Young Lee, in his op-ed in the New York Times on the 6th of September, it was earlier this week, and I will quote it. He said, "For the North, menacing the U.S. is a non-negotiable means of isolating and exercising dominance over Seoul. This is how the regime of Kim Jong-un seeks to ensure its long-term survival." In other words, it's not just leaving them alone. If you leave them alone, they're not going to leave South Korea alone, is the way I interpret this. Or another way this is put, it's called the blackmail theory of nuclear objectives. That Kim Jong-un believes that if he can hold a U.S. city at risk, he'll have more room to bully South Korea, and also to bolster the legitimacy of the Kim regime at home. So if that's true, then we have a much harder problem than the problem that I described of it being a security issue with a status quo power. That would have been easy to solve. I tend to think that Sun Young Lee's view is probably closer to the truth. And if that's true, then we have a really tough problem, and we can't get out of it as easily as I would like. Now, one problem that we have in dealing with this situation is the United States' knowledge and assessment of North Korea is very limited. When Ezra and I were in the government in the 1990s, in the Clinton administration, I think he would agree with me that the widespread view was that the Kim regime would not last more than a decade. And you had a regime which in the 90s was presiding over starvation, which destroyed 10% of its population. And the view that that regime would be able to prosper when you had just across the border to the south, a prospering nation, it seemed very plausible that they were going to be able to last decade. Well, let me tell you, you were wrong. This is why I started by saying, before you pontificate on it, admit your prior mistakes. That was one. I didn't think they would last more than 10 years. And that was the conventional wisdom in the US government in the Clinton period. So we should admit that we often don't know much about North Korea. It's a hard target for intelligence. We don't have a lot of people inside the regime who can tell us what's really on Kim's mind. So it's not like a lot of other intelligence targets where you get readings on various parts of the elite. We don't have very good readings here. And the question then is, if we have had a record of failure, what are the options that we have now? We have a record of American presidents drawing red lines and saying certain North Korean behavior is unacceptable. And we also have a record of Americans consistently accepting what they call unacceptable. Indeed, I've sometimes said that if you were an observer from Mars and you looked down on Earth and you saw the world's only superpower bargaining with one of the smallest, weakest states on Earth, you'd see a poker table where one side had huge piles of chips and the other side had one chip. And you say, now predict which of these two is going to win the game over the next 30 years. You probably would have got it wrong. You might have predicted the superpower. In fact, the North Koreans have outplayed us consistently for 30 years. And I argue in this book I wrote called The Future of Power that the North Koreans have been brilliant at exploiting what I call the power of weakness. The power of weakness means you don't have many alternatives, and you use that to bluff and to take risks, and it works. You know, the conventional way of putting this is that if you owe the bank $100,000, you're in the power of the bank. If you owe the bank $100 million, the bank's in your power. And the North Koreans know that the danger of their collapse or their precipitating something is such that they can play the power of weakness, which gives them much greater ability to take risk and to bluff. So where does that leave us in conclusion? Basically, our current options are very limited. I've already mentioned I don't see much prospect of the use of force. Sometimes people say, yes, but that's going to get worse. We can't wait and let them have a nuclear capability. Well, you know what? We were already deterred in 1994 by their conventional capabilities. North Korea has enough artillery tubes and demilitarized itself to destroy Seoul 35 miles away. And when we contemplated in 94 the prospects of a strike to destroy the Yongbyon facilities, basically the South Korean government and the Japanese government said, no, this will essentially lead to devastation, which we find unacceptable. So and that was conventional deterrence well before they had a nuclear capability. That hasn't changed. You've just added another level to it. So I'm not impressed by the option of force. Similarly, we've used sanctions, and the sanctions have been of some effect in preventing some materials going into North Korea and having some effect on their marginal behavior, but not at the core issue. There's no way that the sanctions are going to squeeze the North Koreans to the point where they give up what Kim Jong-un sees as his hold card, his key asset, which is his nuclear program. If you're willing to see 10% of your population starve, you're willing to tighten the belt quite strongly before you give up your nuclear weapons. The third major option is what I call China diplomacy, which is we'll get the Chinese to solve the problem for us. And this was what the Trump administration seemed to place its major emphasis on. And when Trump met with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago in February, he allegedly said we'd go soft on trade sanctions against China if they would take care of the North Korean problem. Trump came away from that thinking he struck a great bargain. If he knew how much the North Koreans disliked the Chinese and vice versa, and he knew that China was far more afraid of chaos on its borders than it was of a North Korean nuclear weapon, he realized he really hadn't struck a bargain. So where does that leave us? Let me give you my package at the end. And as I warned you at the beginning, it's not very impressive. It doesn't solve the problem. But I think what I could say for it is better than what's on the table now. And these ideas are a combination of ideas that have been put forward by Henry Kissinger, Bob Einhorn, who is at the Brookings Institution, used to handle proliferation in the State Department. And frankly, I used to talk to Steve Bosworth, the late, great Steve Bosworth, about this before he unfortunately died. And you might consider this a China-centric, phased approach with gradual reduction of tensions over a longer period of time. Those you don't demand denuclearization right away. And so it would take the shape of something like the following. The U.S. would assure China of our limited goals and agree to closely coordinate our actions with Beijing. China would use its economic pressure and diplomacy to freeze the immediate threat posed by North Korean tests. In other words, instead of allowing them to continually improve the quality of their missilery and nuclear miniaturization, China would use its leverage for that purpose. Not denuclearization, just preventing this from escalating the threat in the next couple of years. Third, the U.S. would gradually relax some sanctions, and we would accept broadly China's theory that the long-run solution on North Korea is their integration, not their exclusion from the world economy. Fourth, the U.S. would offer to negotiate a peace treaty with North Korea, and that would involve accepting the de facto nuclear status of North Korea, but we would state that our long-term objective was a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, and we would get the Chinese to join us in that. Fifth, North Korea would agree to no tests, missile or nuclear, no further exports of nuclear materials or knowledge, and a gradual détente or easing of relations with South Korea. No more sinking of ships or shellings of islands and so forth. And sixth, and this is a very important part of the package, the U.S. would retain its deterrent and defense capabilities, including our alliances with South Korea and Japan. In other words, this would not be a wishful thinking approach. We'd say, here are 5 things that are major changes, but we're not giving up the capacity to deter if the North Koreans don't live up to this. So to conclude, I would say that this approach is not a panacea. Essentially, what we would wind up doing is agreeing with China to make penalty self-executing if North Korea cheats or breaks the agreements. But it would be based on taking a longer time horizon and trying to use contacts to induce change in North Korea while maintaining deterrence in the shorter run. So this would be the answer to the Soon-Jin Lee problem, which is if the North Koreans are still revisionist, we haven't given up our ability to deter or respond, but we are at the same time putting on the table something which could open up prospects of accommodation and the prospects that that could lead by a phased reduction over a decade toward some lesser degree of enmity and therefore a lesser degree of danger than we now face if we just let events take their course and North Koreans improve their missiles and nuclear weapons, and Trump says this is unacceptable. So that argument is not necessarily going to produce reconciliation. I think it would reduce enmity and reduce danger. But to promise you that it's going to solve the problem or produce reconciliation would be to violate what I warned you about at the beginning, which I have been wrong on this in the past, and I may be wrong again. I think the major argument in favor of what I proposed this morning is that the current policy that the United States has followed has failed for 30 years, and it's hard to do much worse than that. So could we take some risks in a phased way to try to get some reconciliation in the sense of reduction of enmity? I think yes. And I think I proposed a way to do this. I don't think the administration is likely to follow it. So let me end there.
Good.
Thank you, Joe, for words of wisdom, as always. And Professor Nyes will be able to stay with us through. We're going to try to wrap up around 11:30, so I hope that you can be part of the discussion. Professor Lee, where's Professor? Come on out. In that famous speech of Jack Kennedy's, which Joe said, there are particular few lines which I quote all the time, which go something like this, I quote, "History teaches us that those who are enemies often become friends." And of course, he could cite Japan and Germany among others at the time, which is something to keep in mind. And by the way, not a bad speech to read from time to time, just to give you a sense of where we are. Professor Lee, who was at the Fletcher School, is with us, and he's here to make some comments about what we just heard from Joe. So thank you for joining us. I'm Yaseo. I spent 16 months of my life in Munsan, Korea, 7 miles from the DMZ, and actually get pretty good in conversational Korean, but if you don't practice it, you're not going to keep it up. So I can say Moshmudan, Hamida, and a few other things, but conversational Korean isn't anywhere near as good as it used to be. In any event, Professor Lee, it's great to have you with us. And join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen, for this opportunity to share my views with you. And it's a great honor for me to be here at this very meaningful event. Thank you, Professor Nye, indeed, for those words of wisdom and for bringing up the concept of status quo state and revisionist state, and especially for your qualified endorsement of my views as expressed in an op-ed this week. As we get settled down, let me comment, not merely to make a joke, in fact, it's not a joke, But let me say to you, make a bizarre statement. I sincerely believe that Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, is by far the most famous Korean individual outside the Korean Peninsula, as seen from the outside, ever. The most well-recognized figure by name, by photograph, for any Korean. And Professor Vogel might protest and say, what about our friend Pan Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General? But seriously, to the layman, to the ordinary public in the United States and most other parts of the world beyond East Asia, Kim Jong-un is, I would say, even more famous than the Chinese leader. This bizarre aspect of the Korean Peninsula, where you have a model failed state competing for pan-Korean legitimacy against South Korea, which is, by many accounts, perhaps even a singular success story in nation building for a medium-sized country in the post-1945 period. This bizarre dynamic often lends to caricature. That is, North Korea comes across as eminently mockable. Indeed, on the vaunted International Mockability Index, North Korea reigns supreme. There is no such thing, I made it up, pardon me. But they are so mockable, laughable. We are prone to easily be dismissive of North Korea, reducing North Korea often to a child throwing a temper tantrum for attention. That view is understandable and not entirely untrue, but it does kind of reduce North Korea to an infant that may merely react to what we say or do instead of having a plan of its own. To think that North Korea is just content to muddle through, resorting to a provocation every now and then, hoping for some rewards, political and economic concessions, and be pleased to do that forever, is simply patronizing. And that kind of view, that condescension, that kind of patronizing view of the other is deeply embedded in the American psyche. Of course, historically, we have often assumed that small states, leaders of small states, especially those who are our client states, depend on American goodwill and security guarantee and economic support and armed support, will always listen to us, going back to the Chinese nationalists or the South Korean leader, and also true of the other side. If Stalin is supporting, if Mao is supporting so-and-so, the Vietnamese leader, perhaps he will just be content to listen to the bigger powers. I think history shows that to be a false assumption. When the Korean War broke out, a senior official in the State Department, Edward Barrett, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Policy, said that the relationship between Stalin and Kim Il-sung is exactly the same as that between Walt Disney and Donald Duck, meaning Kim Il-sung is Stalin's creation and follows orders. That, ironically, is in a sense the main reason that the US intervened. As Professor Nye said, Truman came of age, achieved his maturity in terms of his political awareness through the 1930s, observing the situation in Europe. When you think of the big players at the time of the Korean War, most were born in the 1880s. MacArthur, Truman, Syngman Rhee, the South Korean leader, was a bit older. Stalin was a bit older, but people born in the 1870s and 80s, Mao a few years younger. Kim Il-sung was born in 1912. He was not quite 40 years old when he waged that campaign to liberate South Korea. So you have that generational gap and perhaps a stronger tendency, proclivity to take a risk on the part of the North Korean leader at the time. Kim Jong-un is 33 years old, not all that much younger than his grandfather when he started the war. Because the United States intervened in the Korean Peninsula, not necessarily to save Korea itself or Korean lives, but for loftier goals, giving meaning to the concept of collective security, giving meaning to the UN Charter, and most importantly, to send a message to Stalin. You do this elsewhere, we will respond. South Korea was saved. But in truth, there was really no compelling reason for that intervention in terms of safeguarding US security after the fact, we know. What about today? If the United States simply served up South Korea on a silver platter to North Korea, I do think sincerely that US security would be better protected. That is, North Korea would lose that incentive to be a growing menace to the United States. But say that were to happen through various steps. A peace treaty between North Korea and the US, which would call into question the raison d'etre of the US troops stationed in South Korea. Many people will say, why are they there? Who will say such things? Americans and South Koreans, in addition to North Koreans. Perhaps the Japanese will protest. The Japanese are very concerned about the emergence of a hostile nation in the Korean Peninsula, with their guns turned toward the Japanese archipelagos. But if the US were, yes, to abandon South Korea, as it basically did when it pulled troops by the summer of 1949, rendering South Korea quite vulnerable, despite what was known of military buildup, despite almost 1,000 cases of shootings, skirmishes between the North and South, leading up to the outbreak of the war in June 1950, Americans were basically ready to abandon South Korea. It was not only Dean Acheson who indeed, at a National Press Club press event in January 1950, left South Korea pointedly out of the US defense perimeter in East Asia, but responsible figures like Kennan, George Kennan, MacArthur, and various other advisors to the president were saying that South Korea is more a liability than a strategic asset. The thing to do is let it fall to the communist side, but not let it look as if we pushed them. So said Owen Lattimore, who was an influential advisor. But when events took over, the United States returned, of course. What about now? If the US were to withdraw troops, conclude a peace treaty, indeed bring down the level of acute enmity between North Korea and the US, would the US be better off? I really don't think so. I think the US would be more prone to return at a significantly higher cost than the tens of thousands of American lives that were lost in the Korean War, with now nuclear weapons quite likely to be a factor. Why? It's not really because of the danger of the loss of US credibility in abandoning a major ally, a key nation, major trading nation of the world. It's more about the change in the security dynamic in the region, which will not be favorable to the United States. Japan will vociferously protest. Japan will call for the United States to return. And the US, I believe, will be trapped to return. Why? Because of the internal dynamic in the Korean Peninsula, because North Korea is a revisionist state that will not be content to fend off the United States and behave as a conventional state, feeling more secure that the US threat is no more, or we can hold the US at bay. The greatest threat to the DPRK is the mere existence of the ROK. It's not the USA. It's the fact that you have across its southern border a very successful, far more legitimate, far more attractive, far richer, far more pleasant, free, alternate Korean state, which serves as a magnet to your own people to which over 30,000 North Koreans at great risk have escaped their own country and resettled in which. This dynamic, over the long term, grows more and more unfavorable to North Korea. Why? Because of the widening economic disparity, wealth gap. Nowhere in the world, I'm fairly certain, nowhere in the world do we see such an enormous income, wealth disparity between two countries sharing a border, as we do in the Korean Peninsula. This is a dilemma, a challenge, I believe, that North Korea cannot overcome unless there's radical change in the nature of the regime. This trajectory, does not favor North Korea's long-term self-preservation. If South Korea were to implode and become a dictatorial state, economic decline setting in, that might be a welcome development for the North Korean regime. But in this pan-Korean contest for legitimacy, we know each Korean state claims to be the sole legitimate Korean government representing the entire Korean nation. It's apparent to much of the world who has won, who is the more legitimate Korean state, but that is an unacceptable proposition for the Kim regime because it calls into question the very thorny question, why are you really necessary? Why is the continued existence of the DPRK really necessary? So can we live with a nuclear North Korea? Can we be resigned to living with a nuclear North Korea, deterring it? And as Professor Nye mentioned, of course, deterrence has been maintained in the Korean Peninsula. Can the status quo be maintained? What is the status quo? In a simple sense, in my humble opinion, the status quo in the Korean Peninsula is de facto peace. Since the end of the war, since the shooting stopped with the signing of the ceasefire agreement in July 1953, we have not had war in or around the Korean Peninsula. It's been a very shaky, very much imperfect peace, but no war, real peace, which enabled South Korea's dramatic development economically, politically. It's been almost 7 decades of prosperity and freedom for the South Korean people, of course, not so much for the North Korean people. Perhaps the most regrettable aspect of this de facto peace over the past 64 years is the continued extreme suffering of the North Korean people, the human rights violations which we often don't talk about, the crimes against humanity, multifaceted crimes against humanity committed by the North Korean regime at the highest state level over the past 7 decades, which according to a landmark UN study released in 2014, quote, has no parallel in the contemporary world. But before I get emotional or too Korean-centric, if I were to imagine, can we really risk peace? And the answer I would give is no. Then what? Then the status quo, as extremely repressive as things are in North Korea, but the status quo, no war, is far more preferable to risking or increasing the risk of another war by US preemptive strike and so on. So can we safeguard that? Can we ensure that the status quo, meaning no war, will hold for the next decades? I'm not so sure. People, more and more Americans are now resigned to living with a nuclear North Korea, assuming that this is feasible. I don't take that view because unlike a nuclear China or a nuclear Soviet Union, North Korea, again, faces a far more successful Korean state across the border, which is an existential threat. China, of course, by the time it changed course and introduced gradual economic reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping, by then, there was no alternate China, which was a magnet to the Chinese people on the mainland. You did not see tens of millions of people choosing to resettle in the ROC. Of course, Mao had exited the political stage, which created a need and opportunity for Deng to change course. But that is not a very good point of comparison to the Korean Peninsula. Also true of the Soviet Union. No alternate Soviet state which posed a threat to Moscow. But the Korean dynamic, again, that has been in place at least since the 1970s, when South Korea outpaced, went ahead of North Korea in terms of industrial output, economic development. This trend will not be reversed. It's irreversible. And that means North Korea will be most unlikely to become a good citizen of the world. It will continue to menace South Korea. It will continue to blackmail South Korea, to censor South Korea, and it will continue to attack South Korea and kill South Koreans. At no point since the end of the Korean War has there been a military response by the United States or South Korea for almost literally countless cases of lethal attacks against Americans and South Koreans. Professor Nye mentioned the axe murder incident. That refers to North Koreans hacking to death two American officers in August 1976, because with prior notification, Americans and South Koreans went into the demilitarizer to prune the branch of a poplar tree. After that, the United States did a show of force in a credible way, and Kim Il-sung issued a statement of regret. That is the only quasi-apology that we've ever seen. But that incident, which impelled Kim Il-sung to de-escalate, was preceded by many, many lethal cases of lethal attacks against Americans. On April 15, 1969, on Kim Il-sung's birthday, North Korean jets shot down a US spy plane some 100 kilometers off the coast of the Korean Peninsula in international airspace, killing all 31 US servicemen on board. Quite early in the Nixon administration, what did the United States do? Well, it considered various actions: a naval blockade, limited bombing of North Korean airfields, seizing North Korean commercial vessels. None of that took place. There was no response. In the meantime, North Korea shot down a US helicopter in August the same year, capturing 3 Americans and released them 4 months later in December, only upon receiving an apology, official apology from the Nixon administration. And for good measure, as that standoff was going on in mid-October, ambushed and shot to death 3 US patrolmen along the DMZ. The point that I'm trying to make is the United States has shown extraordinary self-restraint. Why? Out of altruism? Of course not. For fear of escalation. And I support that policy of self-restraint, which clearly has contributed to keeping the de facto peace in the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, I readily admit that we have spoiled North Korea, and we have conditioned North Korea to assume that it can get away with murder. So, to my mind, we have not yet put enough pressure on North Korea, and I don't mean military pressure, in any way to deter North Korea from disembarking from this path of aggression, calculated provocation, and blackmail, nuclear blackmail included. So what can we do? Everything that Professor Nye mentioned, of course, eminently makes sense. But in closing, let me comment a little bit, very briefly, and on sanctions and make the case that there's a lot more that we can do and that we should do with respect to enforcing sanctions against North Korea. Sanctions today are fundamentally different from Cold War era sanctions, which were mostly trade embargo, no trade. Cuba, of course, is Exhibit A in terms of making the case, therefore, sanctions are not very effective in changing the target nation's behavior or the nature of that regime. US did not trade with Cuba, right? But Cuba traded with US allies, with European countries. That is, it found alternate trading partners. So when sanctions are not uniformly enforced, they become ineffective. What about in the post-9/11 era? Well, the Treasury Department kind of stumbled across a highly effective means of putting non-lethal pressure on the target, going after terrorist organizations. That is, you choke off their money supply to the best of your ability and their partners. You try to isolate the primary target by penalizing, by sanctioning their trading partners, partners that facilitate their financial transactions and do business, continue to do business with that primary target. Iran, I think most of us will agree, returned to the negotiating table. Whether that deal was perfect or flawed, that is not my point, but I think most of us will agree that perhaps the strongest incentive for Iran to return to the negotiating table was that it felt economically isolated, as the United States government traveled all around the world and persuaded European major companies and banks and governments to cut off their financial relations with Iranian entities. Just to give you one example, and this is a prime example, the biggest bank in France, BNP Paribas, was found to be in willful violation of US laws regarding Iran sanctions as well as Sudan sanctions and Syria sanctions. So what did the US do? Well, American officials, Treasury and state officials, talked to the bank and said, this is unacceptable. We will levy a fine of $8.9 billion, yes, with a B, 8.9 billion. They complained, the French president complained, Hollande, but the US did it. And the bank pleaded guilty and paid the fine. Why? For fear of being blocked out of the US financial system. The strength of the US dollar, which is, of course, the preferred medium denomination of international financial transactions throughout the world, for North Korea as well, by the way, as UN panel of expert reports attest. Still, North Korea favors the US dollar over any other currency. That gives the US potential strength in squeezing the target in terms of its money flow. Nothing of that magnitude, $8.9 billion, has yet to be done against the many major Chinese banks and state-owned enterprises we know are in blatant violation of UN as well as US sanctions. Why? I think primarily because of self-deterrence, because of exaggerated fears of more North Korean provocations and Chinese economic retaliation. And although I cannot be sure, there are some precedents, examples of Chinese government behavior and actions taken by China's biggest banks in recent memory over the past few years that suggest that actually the Chinese are more prone to comply rather than retaliate against the US. Banco Delta Asia, a small bank in Macau, was decimated by the Treasury Department in September 2005. That caused a run on the bank. Account holders withdrew their money. Over 6 days, $130 million were withdrawn. Bank of China would not do any further transaction with that bank. North Korea had only $25 million in that bank, but North Korea became isolated almost overnight. What happened? After 1 year of real economic pressure, the Bush administration changed course and made various concessions to North Korea. Why? Because North Korea escalated in a major way with its first nuclear test on October 9th, 2006, on the eve of Party Founding Day, a major holiday in North Korea. The Bush administration not only returned to concessionary nuclear negotiations, but delisted that bank as a money laundering concern, told the North Koreans, you can go and take your money. And North Korea said, no, that's not good enough. Show the world that it's no longer dirty money. How do we do that? Send it to the New York Federal Reserve and then send it to us in Pyongyang. Americans said, we can't do that. We had said that was laundered money. How can we do that? Do it. So the US did it. Had it sent to the New York Federal Reserve Bank and then wire transferred to a small bank in Vladivostok and then on to Pyongyang to make the case that you can do business with North Korea. We're not going to investigate you. Resumed food aid, took North Korea off the state sponsors of terrorism list, and the Bush administration turned a blind eye when it was revealed that North Korea had built a nuclear reactor in Syria, which the Israeli Air Force took out, bombed in September 2007. My point here is even an administration, a US president who was very much ideologically unfavorably disposed toward the Kim regime, we all remember Axis of Evil. Bush also said, unprompted, I loathe Kim Jong-un, referring to his human rights violations. All statements which I endorse in private, but probably statements that are not very helpful. But even for such a president, political expedience took over. Get North Korea out of the headlines. Nikki Haley this week at the UN Security Council said that the era of half measures and procrastination are over, channeling her inner Winston Churchill, who more than 80 years ago said that the era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays, is coming to its close. We are entering a period of consequences. There is the awareness that the past policies vis-a-vis North Korea have not produced any dramatic success. But I would add, that awareness is no guarantor of sustained financial pressure on the target. North Korea will provoke, China will protest, and over the course of next few years, there is always the danger, even a probability, I would say, that the Trump administration will settle for a politically expedient half measure. Sanctions take time. Sanctions, like domestic law enforcement, need to be enforced. It takes a lot of time and effort, a lot of manpower. Sanctions do not produce results in 6 months or a year. At least 3 years, I think. Strong enforcement of sanctions need to be maintained for at least 3 years for there to be any productive outcome. What do I mean? Full denuclearization? No, of course not. They won't. That will come only when the specter of regime collapse, extinction, becomes a palpable threat to the Kim regime, which of course raises the danger of North Korea lashing out, bringing the South down with it. Therefore, there needs to be, throughout this whole process, constant communication to the Kim regime that there's a way out. You know, a posh exile is not what Kim Jong-un deserves, but if the US is able to make a compromise and have Kim Jong-un and his cronies, his families, resettle in China or anywhere else of their choice, that would be a small price to pay for liberating the Korean Peninsula. So the objective of sanctions enforcement should not be regime change. But I think with sustained financial pressure against North Korea and Chinese enablers, we can reasonably expect there to be progress. For example, a freeze, a genuine freeze on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Perhaps limited opening, perhaps slight, pressure taken off in terms of internal repression, perhaps partial closing of the gulags, the political prisoner concentration camps, small changes. That is a lot better than on the balance sheet, on the ledger, what we see in terms of what we have gained by making various concessions, including giving $1.3 billion worth of aid to North Korea. Nothing. All for what? For North Korea's repeated lies of denuclearization. South Korea has given on the record more than $10 billion to North Korea. China, of course, gives at least $1.5 billion to North Korea each year. All for what? For North Korea's strategic deception. So, I think our best, perhaps our only option in terms of putting real pressure on the regime is enforcing tough financial sanctions, which are tough on paper, but quite useless if you don't enforce them. And the truth is, no country, including the US or South Korea, no country has ever, in any meaningful way, enforced sanctions against North Korea. Until the passage of a tough US sanctions legislation against North Korea in February 2016, US sanctions against North Korea were far weaker, both in degree and kind, in terms of the numbers of designations and the kinds of sanctions, than US sanctions against not only Russia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, the Balkan states, but also US sanctions against nations like Zimbabwe, Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, Cuba, Myanmar, nations that don't necessarily pose a security threat to the United States. Still, in terms of just the sheer number of designations, North Korea is the 5th most heavily sanctioned country by the United States, far below US sanctions against Russia. More than 800 entities are designated. Far below US sanctions against Iraq and Iran, a few hundred, 300 or more. 200 entities are sanctions in the DPRK, but this is misleading. It doesn't mean that US sanctions against North Korea today are tough, because 98% of those designations, people reside inside North Korea, which is not very meaningful. You have to go after North Korea's third country partners, which are mainly Chinese. In June this year, the US designated the Bank of Dandong, which has long been known to be a key conduit for illegal dollar transactions with North Koreans. That is a helpful step forward, but the point here is Bank of Dandong is a very small bank. Bank of China, Industrial Commercial Bank, Agriculture Bank, these are the biggest banks in the world, in China itself and in the world. We don't necessarily want to pick a trade war, pick a fight with China, but slowly rising up the financial escalation ladder and putting more pressure by designating bigger Chinese banks and bigger Chinese companies, I think will cause a ripple effect. It will send a message to Chinese banks, which tend to be conservative when it comes to financial risk, that it's not really in our interest to continue to do business with North Korea. So that is the wishful thinking, optimistic note on which I will conclude. But the key point here that I would like to make is we cannot live with a nuclear North Korea. The status quo will not be maintained, and the only way to ensure that the peace and the status quo can continue is by non-lethal means of putting financial pressure on North Korea. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Lee, very much. Is Professor Reverend here? Would you like to leave us?
He cannot, yeah.
Could make it. Okay.
So you introduce.
We've got a short hour for discussion. Shall we begin, Tuan, with...
No, you first. You
Well,
first some things.
I've heard a lot. I'm not sure I got to add a great deal of this, but much more, open this up to all of you
So
to
lastly, just lastly.
comment, so don't worry about me, I mean, I've said my piece. Who wants to begin? Yes?
Well, first of all, I think they were brilliant presentations. I think Joe has this grand sweep of history, and by putting his finger on this issue of reducing enmity, not trying to get them to give up nuclear weapons and so forth, that's a key issue. And the key question that comes to me now is, are they a revisionist state? And if so, how to respond to the revisionist state? And the question I have, as we try to understand the thinking of North Korea, what is going to change them? Will continued stronger sanctions really need them? First of all, can we do it? Can we really control those huge banks and all the little things that North Korea can do in so many different ways, and in such modest amounts? Is that really possible? And is that going to really change the mentality? Let me make another possible argument that we consider it. And that is, supposing North Korea says we're jealous of South Korea, as Professor Lee said, but that we want to improve our economy. Supposing that says, we want to improve the life and make things in North Korea better. The problem with opening up the economy is that outsiders will come in and control it. So I think American offers to say, look, we'll let you begin trading with other countries and let businesses come in, that would probably scare the hell out of them. Because these banks, the South Korean banks and the Japanese versions, are so much more powerful. If I were a North Korean trying to think how to improve the economy, I would say what we need to do is find some ways without really complete opening that allow our economy to grow. And they're already growing, as I understand, something like 3% a year now. It's not bad. It's not fully sanctioned. But perhaps a solution to really change the mentality of North Korea might be in accepting the fact that they could become a stronger economy rather than putting all the weight on sanctions. That's just a question, because I think all of us are wrestling and trying to understand what's going on. I'd be interested in how other people think about that issue.
You want to respond to that?
I have a different cut into this, and it's strictly my ignorance, and for which I apologize in advance. Is it possible to think, put for the proposition that North Korean leadership only wants one thing, this is to have its leadership guaranteed, or its leadership unthreatened, period. Is that a plausible proposition, or are all the issues that we've heard a few moments ago too overwhelming? Population migrates out, etc., etc. I mean, if we simplify to just that element, do we gain anything? Or do we lose anything? Or is it too ridiculous to consider and we just move on?
But I think, honestly, I think that's a very crucial question, because if that was the dominant motivation for North Korea, then this problem is solved. But if Professor Lee is correct, that they need for this, what they see for this, the survival of the regime is not just the rule of the American threat, but the so-called South Korean threat.
So,
Then the problem is much harder.
absolutely. But what if, is it ridiculous to suggest that they might really want a guarantee of some sort, that neither the South nor the US nor anybody else would get them off the table? Because I don't think they're revisionists. I think that they might wish to become part of the system and not worry about threats all the time. The only aspect that I have problems reconciling with this is the statistics of migration outwards. Because if we take a long view, we can imagine the entire population moving out. Sounds ridiculous, but if that were the case, practical hypothesis, if that were the case, how would this alter your views or Professor Lee's views? Would it have any impact?
I don't, I mean, my view, but we ought to have Professor Lee answer on this. My view is that the Kim regime cannot retreat to a position where it says, all I care about is my survival.
It will never say that. Never say
No,
that.
but I mean, I don't, but I also think in reality, they need the myth of their being the vanguard of the Korean people, and that they're going to be, I mean, remember there was this enormous rivalry before the Korean War, where Kim Il-sung was saying, I represent the future of the Korean people, and will unify the peninsula, and I guess it was Syngman Rhee who was saying, we are the future of the Korean people, and was also tempted for unification. I think that's still there. I mean, it's down 2 generations, but I don't think Kim Jong-un can give up that myth.
Professor Lee, you want to respond to that?
North Korea periodically calls for a peace treaty or a non-aggression pact or some kind of security guarantee because they say they are afraid of U.S. quote, hostile policy, U.S. hostile policy. But I think that's more of a ruse than genuine paranoia. For one, deterrence has been maintained even with North Korean conventional weapons alone. 2, I think North Korea does not read too much into a paper agreement because, seriously speaking, I've not yet been able to find any international agreement, a major agreement that they have signed, which they have not blatantly violated both the letter and spirit of that agreement. So a paper agreement ensuring their protection of safety, security, I don't think they will be too moved by that. I think they are smart enough to know that a paper agreement between hostile parties historically has been a canard, it's been a ruse. So I think they really want more than just de-escalation in terms of the acute enmity between Seoul and Pyongyang or Washington. They want more than that. They want more than just outsiders leaving them alone.
Can I just follow on straight with you? Do you want more to the extent of getting the myth fulfilled? Do they want to, is there any?
Well, even now, South Korea is so much richer than North Korea, so much more attractive and so on. Even now, North Korea is able to enforce on the South selective censorship, meaning they threaten to blow up South Korean major news outlets, TV stations, newspapers, human rights activists. And what does the government and the public do? Come on, shut up. Don't push them. Don't criticize them too much. They're a little paranoid. They take real offense. So even calling North Korea out on human rights violations, South Koreans are very resistant to it. When North Korea says, we're going to blow up those activists that send balloons filled with helium, filled with leaflets criticizing Kim Jong-un and other trinkets, then the entire nation is pretty much united in coming out against the activists. We don't want war. Don't do it. Don't provoke them. We remember the Sony Pictures Entertainment event when Sony, I must say, capitulated after North Korea established credibility with its massive cyber attack in November 2014 and then followed up in the days leading up to the release, the date of the release of the thing, said American movie theater goers should stay at home because we're going to bomb those theaters that show the movie. And that led to Sony shelving the film. And President Obama highly critical of that in his last interview with the press before he went on vacation and said there would be a proportional response. I think that, all but forgotten today, incident really is The first case of a foreign country exercising censorship over Americans through intimidation, some might even say cyber terrorism. But we've grown used to making those quote-unquote small concessions, and for North Korea this is a very acceptable proposition. Continue to blackmail them, threaten them, and they shut up. They don't criticize us. They send us money. They make small political concessions here and there. This is an acceptable way of ensuring self-preservation, but there is still some doubt, because, as you suggested, if all of your people go over the fence to the other side, you have a big problem. And that incentive will always be there as long as South Korea remains a prosperous, pleasant country.
I'd like to make Mr. Chairman. I think we're losing sight of just how precarious the situation has become. I think that this is a psychological issue. We have some real cold steel issues. One of which is the weapons themselves, the nuclear weapons in North Korea. How dangerous are they from self-detonation? I spent quite a few decades looking at this, and for a very long time it has been American policy, where possible, to share safety information with potential enemies in order that we don't have an accidental detonation. There's also been a way of getting the militaries at some level, very low and very important, to speak to each other. For example, during the Cold War, we shared safety devices with the Soviets, including insensitive TNT on the head of the weapon to prevent an accidental detonation and a nuclear war by mistake. As there's been more proliferation in recent years, this has become questionable. I think that if we have a disaster with nuclear, it'll probably be as much by accident as by design. The second thing is the Trump administration is not going to back down. Trump wants something to happen, and our military is looking at what I call third waves. Interventions in the north, short of open warfare, hostilities, bombs. Like what possible? Well, first of all, they're working on to what extent can they deter test weapons? Can they knock down missiles? They're very keen on knocking down missiles. The technology is not perfect. We've just had a small success in the test. They're driving hard on that. They would be very undermining of the confidence of North Korea if we knock down a couple of weapons firings. Whether we can do it, I don't know. The other thing is,
I think at this point, let me interrupt, at this point, I think it's quite clear that we can't. There may be some dissent around the world.
I'm not sure of that at all. And the other point is that we tried to mess around with the computers, not terribly successfully. We were more successful in Iran. It is a frontier in which work continues to happen. And the idea of a non-traditional intervention, either by knocking out their weapons or by something else, is very much on the table in Washington. Just come from some talks with people. We are much closer to a bad situation than I think this conversation at this table would allow for.
Actually, I have two questions. One is, I should follow up on the statement that we know we can't, which you challenge. But I would like to ask Professor Lee, everything you say resonates, but there's an inconsistent note with the preservation of the status quo. Because everything you're saying, I believe in, it makes sense, but the status quo is so valuable, it begins to undermine the options. Maybe we should become a revisionist nation, or at least convince the world we're the revisionist nation. Maybe maintaining the status quo, or putting at risk the status quo, would change the deck. I mean, my concern is everyone here is saying there aren't a lot of options. So have we approached this problem from another angle, rather than eliminating the options up front, exploring the options? Because I very much agree with you. And so to me, the status quo really isn't the status quo, it's the beginning of. And I would also like to add that one other issue that you were probably leading up to is, everyone's going to think it's a 10-year window if things go well. Well, what does that have to do, what is the global impact on nuclear non-proliferation if this persists for 10 years and might still go south? So I've covered a lot of things, but I'd love to hear people's insights, please.
Some scholars say the United States is a perpetual revisionist state, this is in Star Wars. I think, in a sense, the Trump administration is doing that, but in a very clumsy way, trying to exude some strategic ambiguity that we may go berserk like you and lash out at you, so beware. I don't think that's a very effective message. I don't think the North Koreans are deterred by that because they know that the other side has way more to lose. The stomach in South Korea for appeasement, for maintaining the status quo and not escalating is very, very strong. The public does not support continued escalation, tit for tat with North Korea. If they shoot at an inhabited island, as they did in 2010, as I mentioned, maybe South Korea will shoot back. But what if they do it again? Maybe South Korea will shoot back. What about the third time, fourth time? No. The support, public support will wane. The United States, of course, has way too much to lose and Korea as well. And that is a very disadvantageous dynamic where you have a perpetual dictatorship that shows no regard for human life, threatening war against an affluent democracy where leaders come and go by elections, where the public has known over the past 7 decades nothing but peace and prosperity. There's simply no support for it. So I don't think that is a feasible option. What I'm vouching for is non-military action, continued financial pressure, which is legitimate in international law in the eyes of the world. And that is not without risk, of course. There's no guarantee of success, but I think it's the least dangerous option for us now.
Professor Lee, can I ask you a question? Because I'm very puzzled with this. There are two people, not two people, but a country that speak the same language. There are relationships, there are family relationships, this kind of thing. Can you describe to us, because I don't quite get this from what I read. So what is that relationship like? Is there ongoing communication? We do have what seems to be, you just described it, a rather strong view on the part of the South that they don't want this kind of thing. We just had elections. The new president strikes me as being somebody who's pretty thoughtful, fairly progressive, seems to want to reach out.